floods, plagues, fire and brimstone. The Bible is packed with legendary punishments inflicted by a vengeful God. These tales of death and destruction may not only be written in mankind's past, but its future.
The modern world is still subject to just the same kinds of catastrophes that you might have read about in the Bible.
But if we are to face God's wrath again, it may be a lot worse. Imagine if our world became transformed by a punishing storm. A worldwide deluge sends an avalanche of water cascading through the skyscraper canyons of New York. A cataclysmic flood that sweeps over Asia and washes away the great capitals of Europe. From space, an unimaginable picture. One massive ocean completely covering the entire planet. Could this great flood be part of our own future? A catalog of catastrophe fills the pages of the Bible. A closer look reveals a number of real natural disasters that could have inspired the biblical tales. Ones that are still some of the biggest threats facing us today. The question remains whether or when they're coming again.
These types of things still resonate today. And in part, it's because people read the Bible as if they're in it. So the natural catastrophes in the Bible still strike a chord today, and people are still perhaps a little scared or wondering if maybe it might not happen again.
Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. And I, behold, I do bring the flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is in the earth shall perish. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, God creates the entire universe in 6 days and destroys it within 10 pages.
God is sending the flood to punish mankind because humans have become corrupt, they've become evil, and he's basically starting over. Wants to get rid of everybody, wants to wash those humans right out of his hair.
Approximately 7,000 years ago, an ancient flood is thought to have swept the Black Sea region, covering approximately 100,000 square kilometers of land. Could this have inspired the story of God's watery wrath? The Black Sea lies north of Turkey and is connected to the Mediterranean by a thin channel of water called the Bosphorus Strait. But in 1998, 2 geologists proposed that this channel did not always exist.
According to the hypothesis, at a time about 8,000 years ago, waters from the Mediterranean catastrophically inflooded into the Black Sea basin. When the natural dam at the Bosphorus finally broke, the entire world's oceans were pushing water into the Black Sea basin.
This hypothesis, known as the Black Sea Deluge, proposes that a gigantic volume of salt water from the Mediterranean flooded into the Black Sea with catastrophic results. For the people populating the Black Sea basin, it was a disaster that could have only been interpreted as divine rage.
It would have been much like Niagara Falls, but probably 20 times in magnitude because of the volume of water that needs to flow through this area to fill into this basin.
In 2000, oceanographer Dwight Coleman and his team began to map the bottom of the Black Sea, looking for evidence of the flood.
So what we're looking at here is using visualization software, and we're able to fly around in here and basically follow the path that the rising sea level would have taken as it flowed into the Black Sea.
The channel cut by the salt water reveals the severity of the deluge.
It's quite clear that there was a very deep channel that was cut as this water flowed across the bottom of the Black Sea. So that indicates to me that there was a very large volume of water that was flowing, and that it was flowing at a very high velocity.
The faster the current, the more devastating the flood. But ultimately, it was the discovery of freshwater shells in the saltwater Black Sea which offered concrete proof of the flood.
7,400 years ago, we have freshwater mollusks growing in the Black Sea. This shell actually does prove that at one point in the past, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake. And then from about 6,900 years ago is about the date of the oldest saltwater shell. So sometimes during that 500-year span is when that change occurred.
This cataclysmic event changed the landscape forever. It's science now. It was terrifying then.
We think that there was perhaps thousands of people living around the shores of the Black Sea at the time of the flooding event, and all those people were then displaced as a result of this flood.
For the primitive agricultural people who were living along the shores of the Black Sea before that, this would have been just an unbelievable sight. It would have seemed like it was indeed a world flooding event.
But what could have caused the Mediterranean waters to rise so high that they flooded into the freshwater Black Sea? Scientists theorize it all began during the last ice age.
The world looked a lot different during the last ice age. First of all, there was an ice sheet like the one on Greenland, about 2 miles thick, that reached as far south as Chicago and New York, and stretched all the way across the continent. So that's a lot of ice.
But from about 11,500 years ago, the Earth began to grow warmer, and melting ice needs somewhere to go.
We obviously lost that 2 mile thick Laurentine ice sheet. It basically dissolved, melted away. All that water went into the ocean, and the oceans rose a couple hundred feet.
The landmass that separated the Mediterranean and the Black Sea couldn't hold back the extra water. When the levee broke, the world was transformed. And this world-changing event could happen again.
Our climate changes are happening in a geologic instant. The ice caps are melting fast, and we've been measuring them with these satellites that measure the lost mass of these massive ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, and these ice losses seem to be speeding up.
This melting ice could cause sea levels to dramatically rise once again.
Remember, just that first 3 feet of sea level rise would create 100 million refugees from coastal areas, disrupting not just where people live, but the entire course of civilizations and societies.
Experts believe a complete loss of both the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets would raise sea levels by over 200 feet. No natural force could unleash that kind of mass meltdown overnight. But if these sheets were to disappear, our planet would be transformed into the ultimate water world.
If we get to the point where both Greenland and Antarctica have melted, then we're talking about a radically different place. That's kind of the Al Gore scenario, with New York wiped off the map, the entire eastern seaboard reconfigured. You know, we're all living kind of on the coastline that was once the Appalachian Mountains. It's a vastly different world.
After the Great Flood, the Bible says that God promises never to wipe out life on earth again. But today, with a variety of cataclysmic disasters waiting in the wings, we cannot be so sure it won't happen, one way or another. If a few of the Bible's 10 plagues were to happen in our world today, it might look like this. A crimson-colored tide assaults the waters around Manhattan, turning the Hudson and East Rivers into tributaries of blood. Thousands of frogs take over downtown. High above, a dense black cloud hovers over the skyline. Huge swarms of locusts are circling the city, looking to devour anything they can. How would we respond to this cascade of catastrophe spiraling out of control?
The modern world is still subject to just the same kinds of catastrophes that you might have read about in the Bible. We still have plagues, we still have earthquakes, we still have all manner of massive storms, and they are still very, very disruptive to our way of life. But if the world today were suddenly being bombarded by one kind of cataclysm after the next, it's a little hard to imagine exactly how we would hold up.
Through the 10 plagues, God sets out to destroy an empire in order to free a people. The Israelites are the slaves of Egypt, and the Almighty wants them released. But the Pharaoh is not about to give up on free labor.
Pharaoh's not so willing to let the Israelites go, and it becomes basically a showdown between God and the Egyptians through these 10 plagues. And each time the plagues happen, they seem to get worse and worse and more destructive.
Exodus chapter 7, verse 17. I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood, and the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river.
We're told with the first plague that all the water turns to blood. So it's not just the Nile River, which of course is a significant river for the Egyptians, but it's all the drinking water as well.
Rotting fish carcasses, blistering heat, no fresh water. It sounds like a horror movie, but not only could this ancient calamity really have happened, it still happens today.
I think most of us, when we read that passage in the Bible, those of us that have studied this problem, see a very good description of a red tide.
Red tide is a sudden bloom or explosion in the population of a certain kind of algae that can produce dangerous neurochemical compounds.
Don Anderson is a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and a leading expert on red tides.
When one of these types of blooms occurs, it can be spectacular. The water changes color. There can be very bad smells from the water. The water can actually look like blood. It can be like tomato soup. It can be that red.
Recent outbreaks in Texas and Florida have littered the coast with hundreds of thousands of dead fish.
The fish that are exposed to some of these algal toxins will die in minutes. Very, very rapid death. Many of these toxins are very, very potent. On the human side, there can be human poisonings. There can be some outbreaks where people along the beach can't breathe because the toxin actually gets aerosolized in the sea spray. And you start to cough and wheeze and have to move away from the ocean because of that irritation. In a region like the delta of the Nile, you have the ocean at one side, you have fresh water, and it's in that type of environment where we actually have quite a few of our red tide species that can then make the water red, kill fish, or make fish poisonous, and so forth. And it then becomes a much more solid explanation.
A red tide triggers a number of domino effects and could explain the second biblical plague of frogs. A severe algal bloom can cause extremely low oxygen levels in the water, making it uninhabitable for life.
If there was a red tide, it wouldn't be unusual to expect certain types of animals to try to escape the water because of this low oxygen condition. They can't swim, they can't be underwater, so it's not out of the question that after a major red tide that frogs just can't be surviving in those conditions and are going to come onto land.
They died on land through desiccation, through lack of food supply, and their food supply were the insects. And if you had no check on the insects, you might expect a proliferation of flying insects or crawling insects in the land of Egypt, and that is what the third and fourth plagues were.
The rotting corpses of the dead frogs and fish attract an immense swarm of flies that plague the Egyptians. A huge infestation of lice follows.
Remember, at a time when people didn't have modern antibiotics, when someone was infested with lice, the scratches could lead to infections that could set up other kinds of serious illnesses.
Humans aren't the only ones affected. Decaying carcasses and flying insects can transmit deadly bacteria, and plagues 5 and 6 do just that. Livestock suddenly become sick and die. Both man and beast suffer an affliction of horrifying pus-filled boils.
Here you have a wonderful explanation for how one fed on the other, how one, very much like a domino, caused the tipping of the next domino all the way down from plagues 1 to 10.
Today, antibiotics mean bacterial diseases can be safely treated. But viruses have no such quick fix. And just as in biblical times, our livestock are on the front line of deadly epidemics.
They can be flu viruses that maybe previously had been living in birds or pigs or some other kind of animal, and then some of them they had evolved that they suddenly could live inside a human host as well.
The recent swine and bird flu outbreaks are warnings humans cannot ignore.
It's seen among a lot of epidemiologists as almost inevitable that at some point, again, you are going to see some kind of bird flu that will evolve to a point that it can take root in human beings and that it can be transmitted much more easily, and it may be more or less deadly.
Surrounded by pestilence and death, the people of Egypt are on their knees. But still the Pharaoh will not be moved. With 4 plagues still to go, the spiral of devastation is far from over. For the Egyptians, the entire empire is on the line. But today, it could be our entire planet in peril.
It's actually probable in a lot of cases that one very bad disaster will set up the possibility for other further bad disasters down the line.
The question is, are we ready for an equivalent of the 10 plagues today?
Halfway through the Bible's 10 plagues, the Nile is contaminated with blood. Dead fish and rotting livestock litter the landscape, while the Egyptians are covered in boils.
I think you put the 10 plagues together, and it's about trying to destroy an entire culture, ultimately till you put them in a watery grave.
No meat, no fish, and nothing to drink. Now, plagues 7 and 8 hit the breadbasket of Egypt. A huge hailstorm batters the wheat fields, and an army of hungry locusts decimate everything in their path.
In the Bible, it said it was the most serious of all of the plagues, even though it didn't kill much in the way of people or animals. But what it did do is kill the Egyptian aspiration of being able to survive.
Today, our own breadbasket is threatened by rising temperatures, which are causing more droughts and stronger storms.
It's pretty difficult to pinpoint exactly what the problems are going to be that humanity faces with this increase in temperatures. But what you can say is that weather is going to get a lot weirder, agriculture is going to have a lot harder time, and we're going to be facing a planet with more people. So you pair all those things together, and you have a pretty grim picture. It's bad news either way for the crops and the farmers.
A hotter planet could also bring a modern plague of pests.
I think the number one surprise that global warming has in store for us is an increase in pests. Already, bark beetles are kind of chewing their way through Canada's forests. We see an increase in mosquitoes, which all the lovely diseases that mosquitoes carry, such as malaria, dengue fever. These are things that we think of as part of the developing world. Well, as the globe warms, the sphere where these mosquitoes can live expands.
In the Bible, the 9th plague becomes the ultimate display of God's power. The descent of total darkness on Egypt.
Imagine their anxiety. Maybe the sun is never coming back. What's going to happen to them?
The hail, storms, and darkness may have all been linked. Some recent studies suggest they are proof that the Bible recorded one of the greatest cataclysms of the ancient world. 500 miles north of Egypt lies the Greek island of Santorini. In the 16th century BC, Santorini was blown apart in one of the largest volcanic explosions of the last 10,000 years.
It was more than 50 times bigger than the Mount St. Helens eruptions in 1980. So it was the largest event that would have been seen in that region, in the Mediterranean, over historic times.
Could the stories of Santorini's explosion have made their way into the Bible?
Well, a volcanic eruption that big would put a plume of material up into the atmosphere, going up 10 to 20 miles. So people would see ash fall raining out of the sky. They would see darkness because the cloud of dust would cut out sunlight.
Recently, physical proof was found that ash from Santorini reached Egypt 530 miles away.
The physical evidence for the ash is ash layers that have been found in a lake on the Nile Delta. So we know that the ash went that way towards the east and fell out over that region.
The eruption could also explain the devastating hailstorms.
Volcanic ash in the atmosphere can cause atmospheric instability, can cause a rainfall or thunderstorms. And in those thunderstorms, you would get hail as well.
Today, one of our famous national parks is a volcanic ticking time bomb with 100 times the explosive power of Santorini in its belly.
Yellowstone is a super volcano. It's had a number of super eruptions. The last one was 600,000 years ago. And when we look at the history of Yellowstone, we see that about every 600,000 years, Yellowstone produces a supervolcanic eruption. So one might say we're overdue for a volcanic eruption of that size in the Yellowstone caldera.
If the Yellowstone caldera were to actually erupt again, if we saw that kind of supervolcano today, we're looking at literally a continent-spanning level of damage.
The Santorini explosion would have killed in the thousands. But if the 30-mile-wide Yellowstone caldera explodes, we could be looking at much worse. Ash in the atmosphere would plunge the entire planet into an apocalyptic winter. The final death toll could be up to 1 billion worldwide.
And And so it isn't a question of if the volcano is going to go off again. It's a question of when, and there's no way to stop it.
In the Bible, what finally persuades the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go is not the ruin of his empire, but the death of his firstborn son. The 10th plague kills all firstborn males in the empire.
Every family mourned, and I think that's in some ways the power of that particular plague.
And even this may have been the result of previous plagues. The hailstorms and locusts that destroyed the crops would have forced the Egyptians to rely on stored grain. But grains can grow deadly molds and toxins when stored underground.
The mold produced a very, very powerful chemical, a molecule that's biologically active, and that's called a mycotoxin. And these mycotoxins in de minimis amounts, that is to say, a few molecules, can kill humans and animals quite rapidly.
And typically, it would be the firstborn male who was fed the most.
There was a tradition that the eldest usually got double portions, so they're getting more than the amount that the subsequent kids or children would get, and so they would die.
The plagues rip apart an empire, piece by piece. But elsewhere in the Bible, it takes only an instant to destroy a city and its inhabitants. Unfortunately for us, the same is true today. A city where money talks, the good times roll, and the beautiful people live every day like it's their last one on earth. Now, imagine. A dark shadow descends over the Los Angeles skyline. Streams of cinder and ash begin to trickle down from above. Suddenly, the heavens open up and God's wrath is unleashed. Millions of lives are snuffed out in an instant. It's happened before. Genesis chapter 19, verse 24 through 25. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all of the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. Many have tried to locate these famous cities of sin on a map. In the 1970s, archaeologists in modern-day Jordan excavated 2 abandoned city sites that may have inspired the biblical tale.
In about 1979, the archaeologists suggested very tentatively that if there is any historical kernel of truth of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that maybe it's the ruins of Babadra and Numaira that might have started all this off.
The walled city of Babadra once sat atop a large hill looking over the Dead Sea Plain. All that is left now is rubble. But the city's cemetery reveals its significance. Mohammed Najjar is an archaeologist and the former head of the Department of Jordanian Antiquities.
The cemetery of Babadra is a huge one, and not all the tombs had been excavated. But the researchers came to the conclusion that at least we have here around 20,000 burials.
Even today, human bones litter this landscape.
These huge cemeteries, that's indicator for the size of the population in the area. So we are talking about very densely populated area, and this is really, very unique for the Bronze Age of Jordan.
Babadra seems to have been quite a large city, as it were, probably a couple of thousand inhabitants. So it does look like Babadra was a fairly important city for its time.
A thriving civilization lived here for more than 600 years. But around 2350 BC, the gate of the city was hurriedly sealed, and the town was mysteriously and completely abandoned. No one knows why. Just 8 miles away, the city of Numera also shows evidence of sudden desertion. But here, the reason for the speedy exit is clear.
We are looking at about almost 2 feet of ash deposits here, including some surfaces here caused by fire. And we know that this thick deposit of ash cannot be caused through domestic use of fire. So probably it was a major fire.
Next to the town's fortification tower, the archaeologists found further proof of disaster. Unburied human remains.
We are here next to the tower. So the skeletons had been found in this area, and we believe that these people had been crushed when the tower collapsed. They were covered by the rubble.
The severely crushed bones revealed a possible cause for the fire.
Bones had been examined by the physical anthropologist. The conclusion was that these people were crushed by the earthquakes.
4,500 years ago, a devastating earthquake ripped through Numera. The fortification tower and walls of the city collapsed, and a huge fire was sparked. This was not the first or the last earthquake to terrorize the people living next to the Dead Sea. Small earthquakes occur in this region daily, and every century or so, a big one strikes.
The reason why this area is so geologically unstable is that it lies right on top of a seam between 2 tectonic plates, that is, 2 big pieces of the Earth's crust.
And by the Dead Sea, you don't have to look far to bring brimstone into the story.
In terms of using the phrase fire and brimstone, fire's pretty obvious. Brimstone is simply sulfur. So it's actually fire and sulfur which go together.
Sulfur, in both its solid and gas form, occurs naturally in the area and is highly flammable.
When the Bible talks about the brimstone and fire, this is exactly what they were describing. The ancient inhabitants of the area were familiar with this kind of stone, and that's why it had been used in the Bible.
Today, our own catastrophes could inspire a new round of written legends. And if the predictions are correct, cities in California will have a lot to write about. An ancient earthquake that rips apart a landscape and sparks a fire that ravages everything in sight. 2 cities lie in ruin. Babadra and Numera may well have inspired the tale of Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the Bible's most famous destruction stories.
Numera now looks like it was actually destroyed earlier than Babadra. They were not destroyed at the same time. That said, if there are people wandering around the southern end of the Dead Sea at, say, 1800 BC, and they're looking at the ruins of Babadra and Numera sitting there abandoned centuries after it was destroyed, and somebody coming along later says, hey, what happened over there? Oh, in that city, oh, there was great sin and the gods destroyed it.
Numera was home to hundreds before an earthquake sealed its fate. The 2010 tragedies in Haiti and Chile show modern quakes can put millions in danger.
Because in the modern world we have so much more densely populated urban centers than ever existed back in the ancient times, the scale of devastation would be almost unimaginable and far exceed anything that could ever have happened back in biblical times.
America's West Coast should heed the warnings of past and present. Just like the Dead Sea region, the California coast sits on top of a fault that separates two huge tectonic plates.
San Andreas Fault is one of the most active faults in the entire world. It runs past San Diego, it runs through Los Angeles, runs up through San Francisco. Both of these plates are in motion. Pressure builds up as these two plates grind against one another, and occasionally that force is suddenly released in a sort of spectacular earthquake-like fashion.
In the next 30 years, there is a 99% chance that California will be hit by an earthquake that measures at least 6.7 on the Richter scale. Geologists agree that Southern California and its famous city Los Angeles is most at threat.
Southern California is one of the most populated areas of the country. In fact, the second most populated area of the country. It has more than 24 million people in it.
The region is approximately 150 years overdue for a megaquake. And the results of the next big one would be disastrous.
We have this infrastructure of power and lights and water that are constantly running through our cities. So, for example, a bad earthquake that starts to rupture gas mains and water mains will suddenly now create huge fires and flooding that can run through cities.
It remains difficult to predict an earthquake and impossible to stop one. All California can do is wait. Earthquakes, supervolcanoes, megafloods. If any of these terrifying disasters were to destroy our planet, we may think the end of days are near. And it is the last book in the Bible that may tell us what to expect.
It's very difficult to actually interpret the book of Revelation. It's, was it a dream? Was it reality? What's going on here?
Revelation is a terrifying prophecy that makes other biblical disasters look like a walk in the park. Riding the wave of these horrors are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. War, famine, pestilence, and death plague the earth. Darkness reigns. The stars even fall out of the sky. And it is this part of the prophecy that astrophysicists would argue we take seriously.
In many religions, we talk about the falling of the stars from the sky. Actually, perhaps the only event that could destroy all life on Earth, essentially instantaneously, comes from outer space.
Our final blow could streak down from the heavens, literally. Revelation. It is the final book of the Bible. And many believe a glimpse into what will be the end of our days. But Revelation also describes a future where the sky turns on planet Earth. Revelation chapter 6, verse 13. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth. Today, this passage conjures up a number of real-life threats.
We have the possibility of asteroid collisions, possibility of cometary impacts that could perhaps obliterate all life on Earth, perhaps within a matter of minutes.
we could find ourselves facing the same destiny as the dinosaurs. 65 million years ago, a 6-mile-wide asteroid fell from the sky and slammed into Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, driving them to extinction.
The size of that cataclysm is beyond anything that we can easily picture. As a result, this giant extinction event was so huge that it seems to have killed roughly half the species of life on Earth.
If it happened once, chances are it can happen again.
Apophis is a whopper of an asteroid. It is about 1,000 feet across, about the size of the Rose Bowl Stadium. If this object were to plow into the planet Earth, it would hit with a force of approximately 100,000 Hiroshima bombs.
In 2029, Apophis will make a close enough pass that you will be able to see it with binoculars. The asteroid will come about 18,000 miles from planet Earth, a distance closer than some of our own satellites.
Depending upon how it goes around the Earth, it'll make a second pass in 2036. And at that point, we don't know whether it's going to hit or not. The recent probability estimates show that perhaps the chance of an impact is 1 in 100,000. But we really don't know. It's black magic when we talk about predicting the precise path of a planet-killing object.
From the first pages of Genesis through the end of Revelation, the Bible lays out a daunting list of potential death sentences for mankind. But even if we dodge all these supernatural bullets, there's still one we can't avoid.
The Bible talks about from dust to dust, ashes to ashes. We physicists say from stardust we came, and stardust we will return. 5 billion years from now, we will have the last nice day. After that, the sun will begin to expand enormously and become a red giant. The sky will be on fire. You will look from horizon to horizon, and you will see the sun occupy the entire sky.
Maybe we need to build our own kind of giant space ark. Set sail for some other haven, kind of Mount Ararat of a planet on another solar system. That's quite an ambition.
Every age of man will have to face its own barrage of disasters. But the Bible's search for an explanation in the face of tragedy is a universal desire. It is something we share with our ancestors and will share with our descendants.
These are themes that resonate throughout human consciousness or even throughout human fears. These get right to the primal fear of afterlife, what happens after death. So even with all of our scientific acumen today, we're still a little bit religious about things, if you want to put it that way.
No one can predict what lies ahead. But sooner or later, new disaster stories will be added to the old ones, as future generations are introduced to forces beyond mankind's control.